The air every October 31st was different. It tasted of wood smoke and decay, of chilled earth and the faint metallic promise of frost. For Leo, a small boy of 7, it was the most exquisite perfume in the world. It was the smell of Halloween. For weeks, his world had been a countdown. Paper bats and cardboard skeletons had slowly invaded the classroom, and the supermarket aisles had transformed into rivers of orange and purple. But the true centerpiece of his anticipation was the ritual of trick-or-treating. His parents had spoken of it in hushed, reverent tones, painting pictures of a twilight world where children became ghosts and superheroes, and neighbors rewarded bravery with fistfuls of sugar. It was a night of magic, they said. A night where anything was possible. Leo stood at his bedroom window, his small palms pressed against the cool glass. Outside, the afternoon sun was a weak, lemon-yellow disk, already beginning its slow descent behind the skeletal trees. Shadows stretched long across the lawns, deepening into pools of ominous purple. Every rustle of a leaf, every distant shout from other children was an electric jolt to his system. His heart was a tiny, frantic drum against his ribs. He had practiced for this. He'd rehearsed the words until they felt like a sacred incantation on his tongue. Trick or treat. He envisioned the heavy weight of his plastic pumpkin bucket, the satisfying thunk of another candy bar landing inside. He imagined the glowing porch lights, beacons of generosity in the gathering dark. But intertwined with the excitement was a delicious, shivering thread of fear. The stories his older cousin had told him lurked at the edges of his mind, tales of haunted houses and things that scurried in the dead leaves. It was a fear he welcomed, a crucial ingredient to the night's potent cocktail. He knew with the absolute certainty of a child that the monsters weren't real. They were just stories, just costumes. The real magic was in the candy, in the adventure, in the permission to be out after dark. He didn't know that the true monsters didn't hide in the shadows of stories. They were born from them. And tonight, the air didn't just smell of candy and autumn. If one listened very closely, beneath the laughter and the rustle of costumes, it smelled of blood yet to be spilled. Leo took a deep, excited breath, utterly unaware that he was breathing it in. The promise of candy was all he could see, blinding him to the terrible promise of the coming night. The centerpiece of the night's magic lay on Leo's bed, waiting. It was not a store-bought costume of flimsy plastic and printed nylon. This was his father's creation, a project born from love and a deep appreciation for the classic monsters of old. It was a Frankenstein's monster suit, and to Leo, it was a thing of terrifying beauty. The jumpsuit was a heavy, weathered canvas, stained in varying shades of bog green and murky gray. His father had meticulously rubbed dirt into the knees and elbows, not to soil it, but to grant it the authentic grime of the grave. Down the front, thick, uneven stitches of black yarn crisscrossed the fabric, mimicking the savage sutures that held the monster together. These were not neat and tidy. They were grotesque, raised welts that looked like they held something unspeakable beneath the surface. But the true masterpiece was the headpiece. A large boxy hood of the same material, it was stuffed with padding to distort the shape of Leo's small head. The face was a pallid mask of rubber, with a grotesque stitched scar running up the forehead, and another pulling down the lip on one side, giving the mouth a permanent lopsided snarl. The hair was a wild, shock-black yarn, matted and chaotic. Leo's mother helped him into it. The fabric was stiff and smelled of attic dust and acrylic paint. As he pulled the mask over his head, his world narrowed to the 2 eye holes. His vision framed by the mottled, dead flesh of the monster. His own breath became hot and loud in the confined space, a damp, rhythmic sound that was already not quite his own. He stood before the full-length mirror, a small, grave-born giant. The costume was bulky, making his movements awkward and shuffling. In the dimming light of his room, the reflection was not a little boy playing dress-up, something else. Something that had been stitched together from forgotten parts and jolted into a shambling half-life. The empty, black eyes of the mask seemed to swallow the light. A thrill, cold and sharp, pierced his excitement. For a fleeting second, the figure in the mirror felt separate from him, a vessel waiting for a different, more malevolent spirit to inhabit it. He raised a hand, the glove ending in clumsy, stitched fingers, and the reflection did the same. The movement was slow, deliberate, as if the limbs were heavy with the mud of the churchyard. His father chuckled, a warm human sound that broke the spell. "Perfect," he said, clapping a hand on the bulky shoulder. "You look like you just climbed out of a lab and into a nightmare." Leo smiled beneath the mask, the rubber pressing cold against his lips. He was no longer just Leo. He was a monster. He was powerful. He was ready. He practiced his monster walk, a stiff-limbed gait that made the floorboards creak and let out a low, rumbling groan. It was a game. A wonderful, terrifying game. He never considered that some costumes born from such loving detail and dark inspiration might remember what they are supposed to be, and that on a night when the veil is thin, they might just decide to become real. The world through the mask's eye holes was a tunnel, a framed portrait of the twilight world. The familiar contours of his own street were gone, replaced by a landscape of looming shadows and pulsating jack-o'-lantern grins. Each flickering candle flame looked like a malevolent watching eye. The heavy costume was no longer just fabric and stuffing. It felt like a second skin, a husk that was slowly settling, its weight becoming his own. His father walked beside him, a reassuring silhouette against the deepening blue of the evening. But even his presence felt distant, separated from Leo by the layer of the monster. The plastic pumpkin bucket, clutched in Leo's stitched finger glove, swung by his side, its hollow rattle the only sound that felt truly his. They approached the first house. It was the Millers, who always gave out full-sized chocolate bars. A beacon of warm, welcoming light spilled from their porch, cutting a bright path through the gathering dark. The cheerful glow should have been inviting, but to Leo's narrowed perception, it felt like a spotlight on a stage. And he was the main actor in a play whose script he was beginning to forget. His small legs, made clumsy by the suit, carried him up the path. The neatly trimmed lawn seemed to stretch forever. With each step, the costume's musty scent filled his nostrils. A smell of soil and something older, something chemical like ozone after a lightning strike. His own breath, hot and moist, recycled against the rubber mask, and the low, ragged sound of it was the only thing in his ears. He reached the door. The cheerful wreath of autumn leaves seemed to mock him with its normalcy. He raised a hand that felt too heavy, the stuffed fingers curling into a makeshift fist. The knock he delivered was not the timid tap of a little boy. It was a dull, thick thud, like a weight dropping against the wood. It was the sound of something solid, something substantial demanding entry. He heard footsteps inside, light and quick. The porch light above him felt like an interrogator's lamp. The door swung inwards, and Mrs. Miller stood there, her face arranged in a smile, a large bowl of candy in her hands. But the smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Her eyes, which usually crinkled with warmth, widened just a little as they looked down at him. She didn't see Leo. She saw the monster. She saw the lopsided snarl, the dead black eyes, the crude stitches holding it all together. The costume was too good, too unnerving in the half-light. "Well, hello there," she said, her voice a little too high, a little too bright, trying to cover her instinctive tremor of unease. My, what a scary costume. Leo opened his mouth. The words were there, practiced 100 times. Trick or treat. But what came out from behind the mask was not his clear, childish voice. It was a low, gravelly noise, a guttural rumble that seemed to vibrate through the costume's chest. It was the groan of the monster. He thrust his bucket forward. The movement was jarring, unnervingly swift. Mrs. Miller's composure broke entirely. She gave a nervous little jump, and without another word, fumbled 2 large chocolate bars into his bucket, her fingers brushing against the stitched glove, as if it were something unclean. She couldn't get the door closed fast enough, the lock clicking into place with a sharp final sound. Leo stood there for a moment, staring at the closed door. The encounter should have been a victory to full-size bars, but a coldness had seeped into him, a feeling far chillier than the autumn air. He hadn't been greeted as a boy in a fun costume. He had been received as a creature, and a part of him, deep within the confines of the mask, had liked the fear in her eyes. He turned, his shuffle a little more pronounced, a little less like a game, and moved back towards the shadow of his waiting father. The first kernels of a profound and terrible loneliness taking root in his heart. The cold feeling from the first house did not leave him, festered. With each new door, each new encounter, the costume felt less like a disguise and more like a cocoon tightening around him. The polite, slightly nervous reactions of his neighbors were no longer a game. They were a rejection. They saw the monster, and they recoiled. The weight of the mask became a prison. His own hot, ragged breath, the only constant in a world that was shrinking to the view through two black holes. His father's presence was a fading echo. The man's encouraging words were muffled, distorted by the layer of rubber and stuffing, becoming meaningless noises. Leo's world was now the rhythmic scrape of his boots on the pavement, swing of the bucket, and the deep, unsettling hunger that was beginning to gnaw at him. A hunger that had nothing to do with candy. They turned onto a street he didn't recognize, a cul-de-sac where the ancient oaks grew close together, strangling the light from the street lamps. The houses here were older, set further back from the road, their windows dark and watchful. At the very end of the circle stood a house that seemed to drink the surrounding darkness. It was a Victorian relic, its paint peeling like sunburnt skin, its gables twisted like broken bones. No pumpkins adorned its steps, no cheerful lights warmed its porch. Only a single bare bulb glowed above a door of blistered wood, a sickly yellow eye in a face of shadows. A deep instinctual fear, the kind that lives in the marrow, told Leo to turn away. This was not a house that promised treats. This was a house that knew only tricks. But the costume seemed to have a will of its own. His feet, clumsy and heavy, carried him forward up the cracked flagstone path. The air grew colder with every step, carrying the scent of damp rot and dried herbs. His father lingered at the gate, a hesitant silhouette. "Leo, I don't know about this one, buddy. Looks like nobody's home." But Leo was already at the foot of the creaking porch steps. The command was no longer his own. It was the monster's pilgrimage. He climbed, each step a thunderous report in the silent night. He stood before the door, a small, stitched-up supplicant before a dark altar. He could feel a presence on the other side, a patient, ancient stillness waiting for him. He raised his heavy fist to knock. As his knuckles were an inch from the wood, the porch light above him died. It didn't flicker, it didn't fade, it was simply extinguished, plunging him into a profound darkness that was absolute. The light from the street and the moon did not penetrate here. It was a void. The only sound was the frantic thumping of his own heart, a trapped bird beating against the cage of his ribs. He was alone. He could not see his father, could not see the path behind him. There was only the dark and the door. And then, with a sound that was not a sound, but a release of pressure, the door swung inward. The space within was blacker than the night, a maw of impenetrable shadow. There was no outline of a person, no friendly greeting, just a depth of nothingness. From within that nothing, a hand emerged. It was not the hand of his father, or any neighbor. It was a gnarled claw, its skin like parchment stretched over brittle bones, its nails long and yellowed. It did not hold a bowl of candy. It was simply waiting, hovering in the air, an invitation to a transaction that was never about candy at all. It was waiting for his bucket, waiting for his offering. And Leo, his small body trembling within the confines of the monster suit, felt his arm move as if pulled by a string. He slowly, helplessly extended the plastic pumpkin towards the waiting claw. The gnarled hand did not take the bucket. Instead, its cold, dry fingers, like bundles of twigs, closed around Leo's wrist. The touch was electric, a jolt of ice that shot up his arm and seized his heart. He tried to pull back, to scream for his father, but his voice was gone, stolen by the suffocating dark. His body was locked in place, a prisoner of the ancient grip. From the deeper blackness within the doorway, a figure leaned forward. She was a sculpture of wrinkles and shadows, her face a collapsed map of bitter years. Her eyes were milky, blind, yet seeing everything. She smelled of dust and dried grave earth, of bitter herbs and secrets best left buried. She pulled his wrist closer, her strength impossibly vast. Her other hand emerged, its nails tracing the crude stitches on his costume's arm, then moving to the rubber mask of his face. She caressed the fake scar there, and a thin, cruel smile stretched her lips, revealing gums as barren as a winter field. "A monster," she whispered. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the silence like a razor, a dry rustle of dead leaves. It was a sound that bypassed the ears and spoke directly to the soul, cold and absolute. "You wear the skin so well, little one. You ask for a treat, but your heart begs for a trick, whispers to me of loneliness. It cries out to be seen." Leo trembled, a violent, helpless shudder that racked his entire small frame. Tears welled in his eyes, hot against the cold rubber, but he was powerless to look away from her milky gaze. "Very well," she hissed, her breath a foul wind against his mask. "I shall give you what you truly seek. No more pretending, no more knocking. Tonight, you will not be a boy playing at being a monster." She leaned in so close, her papery cheek brushed against his, and her whisper became the only thing in the universe, a venomous seed planted directly into his ear. "Tonight, you will be the monster. The world will see you, and it will know true fear. Your hunger will be real, your strength will be real, and the treats. Oh, the treats will be the warmth that spills from the unwilling." She released his wrist. As she did, a searing pain, like a brand of ice, remained where her fingers had been. Leo stumbled backward, his plastic pumpkin falling from numb fingers, its contents scattering across the rotten porch boards like worthless pebbles. He turned and fled, scrambling down the steps and into the night, crashing into the concerned arms of his father at the gate. "Leo, what happened? You're shaking. What did she say?" But Leo could not answer, could only clutch his wrist, where the invisible brand throbbed with a cold fire. The old woman's words echoed in his mind, over and over, a cursed record on a loop. They were no longer just words, they were a law. They were a new truth. And as his father led him away, casting a fearful glance back at the now dark, in Silent House, the first true, ravenous pang of hunger twisted in Leo's gut. It was a hollow, aching void that he knew, with a terrifying certainty, that candy could never fill. The walk home was a fever dream. The cheerful lights of the other houses seemed to smear into garish mock. The laughter of other children was a distant, irritating noise, like the chittering of insects. Leo clung to his father's hand, but the comfort it once offered was gone. The man's grip felt feeble, the skin and bone beneath it terrifyingly fragile. The cold brand on Leo's wrist pulsed in time with his heartbeat, a dead, icy rhythm that was slowly replacing his own. The curse was a living thing inside him, a parasite unfurling in the warmth of his blood. It fed on his fear, on his loneliness, on the lingering memory of every nervous glance and slamming door. The old woman's words were not an echo anymore. They were a command being written into his very cells. They arrived home. The familiar front door with its cheerful wreath seemed to belong to another life. As they stepped inside, the warmth of the house felt oppressive, suffocating. His mother knelt, her face a mask of concern that he could barely recognize through the eye holes. "Honey, what's wrong? You're white as a ghost. Let's get this scary thing off you." Her fingers reached for the headpiece, for the zipper of the costume. But as her hand touched the rough stitched fabric, a jolt of pure, defensive hatred surged through Leo. A guttural snarl ripped from his throat. A sound that was utterly alien, tearing from a place deeper than his lungs. His mother recoiled, her eyes wide with shock and hurt. Leo. The sound of his name was a trigger. It was the name of the boy. The weak, pretending boy. The monster did not have a name. Agony seized him. It was a pain of expansion and rupture. He convulsed, collapsing onto the living room rug. His back arched as the cheap yarn stitches on the costume began to pop, one by one, with sounds like snapping tendon. The costume was no longer a costume. It was a second skin, and it was splitting because he was outgrowing it. Beneath the splitting canvas, his own flesh was changing. His small frame twisted, bones cracking and lengthening into a hunched, powerful posture. His fingers, inside the stitched gloves, thickened and sharpened into claws that tore through the fabric. A bestial roar filled the room, drowning out his mother's scream and his father's shout of disbelief. The rubber mask melted, fusing to his face. The lopsided snarl was no longer fake. It was his mouth pulled back over needle-sharp teeth. The black, empty eyes of the mask became his eyes, glowing with a faint, sickly green light from within. Where a little boy had stood now crouched a thing of nightmare. It was a crude, horrifying mockery of Frankenstein's monster, but made of living, breathing flesh and fury. The stitches on his skin were real now, weeping a thin, dark fluid. He was hunger, he was rage, It was the trick made flesh. His first coherent sight was the terrified face of his mother, her hand pressed to her mouth. The last vestige of Leo screamed inside the monster's mind, a silent plea. But the hunger was too great. The need for a treat, the warm red treat the old woman had promised, was all that was left. He moved with a speed that was blinding. There was no thought, only instinct. A clawed hand lashed out. The scream was cut short, replaced by a wet, horrific sound of tearing. Crimson splashed across the cheerful floral wallpaper, across the family photos on the mantel. The warmth he had craved finally came, spraying across his face, and it was better than any candy. It was life. It was power. His father charged at him, a baseball bat raised in a futile, heroic gesture. The monster turned, and with a backhanded swipe that contained the force of the curse, it was over. Another burst of warmth. Another satisfying silence. The thing that had been Leo stood in the center of the room, its chest heaving, its claws dripping. The house was quiet save for the slow, steady drip of the treat onto the floor. The hunt had begun. He remembered every house that had turned him away. Silence. It was the first thing the monster understood. The screaming had stopped. The only sounds were the wet, dripping tap of its claws and a low, satisfied growl rumbling deep within its chest. The warmth that coated its hands and face was already cooling, becoming sticky. The hunger for a few precious moments was sated. It had fed on the first most readily available treats. A flicker of memory, a ghost of the boy it had been, tried to surface. A memory of a woman's loving touch, a man's proud laugh. The monster snarled, shaking its heavy head as if to dislodge a fly. Those memories were weak. They were lies. This warmth, this metallic taste in the air, this was truth. This was power. Turned from the ruin of the living room and shambled toward the front door. Its movement was no longer a child's imitation of a monster's walk. It was the real thing eloping, powerful gait that made the floorboards groan in protest. It did not open the door, simply walked through it, the old wood splintering into 1,000 pieces around its frame. Explosive announcement of its exit into the night. The cool night air hit its face, carrying 1,000 new scents. It could smell the sweet rot of pumpkins, the wax of candles, the cheap polyester of costumes. But underneath it all, it could smell the thing it truly craved. The hot, salty scent of fear and the rich, coppery scent of life just beneath the skin. The street was still alive with the shallow celebration of Halloween. Giggling witches and boisterous superheroes ran from house to house, their plastic buckets swinging. They paid no mind to the hulking, stitched-together shape emerging from the shadows of the shattered doorway. They thought it was just a very good costume. Its milky green eyes scanned the street, ignoring the children. It was not interested in them. Its purpose was singular. Its list was clear. It remembered. It remembered every porch light that had flicked off as it approached. Every door that had been closed a little too quickly. Every nervous laugh and look of unease. It offered no treats. Now there would be no more tricks, only consequences. It crossed the street, its shadow stretching long and monstrous under the moon. Its first target was the Henderson house. Old Man Henderson had scowled through his window and pulled his curtain shut before Leo had even reached the steps. The monster did not knock. It drove a fist through the front window, the glass exploding inward in a glittering shower. Scream echoed from inside, high and terrified. It was a sound that fueled the monster, that made the hunger return with a sharper, more urgent edge. It clambered through the jagged hole, ignoring the glass tearing at its tough hide. What happened inside was not a haunting. It was a slaughter. It was swift, brutal, and devastatingly efficient. The monster was not a specter. It was a physical force of nature, an engine of rending and breaking. The warm treat was claimed, and the house fell silent, save for the drip. Drip, drip onto the floral-patterned carpet. It emerged back onto the street, now painted in a fresh layer of crimson. This time it was seen. A group of teenagers too old for trick-or-treating loitering on a corner fell silent, and their laughter died in their throats. One of them pointed a trembling finger. What? What is that? The monster turned its glowing gaze upon them, took a step forward, then another. It began to run. Screams that were not part of the holiday festivities now ripped through the night. The air, once filled with the smell of candy in autumn, was now thick with the unmistakable temps of blood and raw terror. The monster was a whirlwind of claws and fury, a promise made flesh, delivering the only trick it had left to give. The hunt was on, and the entire neighborhood was its treat basket. The monster was a sculptor of carnage, and the neighborhood was its clay. It moved with a terrible, relentless purpose, a shambling engine of retribution. Its path was not random, was a grim itinerary, a circuit of every slight, every denied treat, every flicked-off porch light burned into its cursed memory. The list was long, and it was methodical. The air was thick with the symphony of its work, the splintering crack of doors torn from their hinges, the brief, sharp crescendo of screams, and the wet final sounds that followed. The warm, coppery treat it had been promised was everywhere. It drank it in, each house sating the hunger for only moments before it roared back, sharper, more insistent. The stitches on its arms and face were dark and damp, not with the thin fluid of before, but with the evidence of its feast. It turned onto Maple Avenue, its glowing green eyes fixing on a small, well-kept bungalow with a friendly ghost decoration swaying from the porch roof. This was the home of Mrs. Gable. She had answered Leo's knock days ago. It's not on Halloween, but when he was selling school fundraiser candy bars, she had sighed, said she was on a fixed income, and closed the door on his hopeful face. The rejection had stung, a small, sharp pinprick of shame he'd carried home. The monster remembered this sting as a glaring offense. It mounted the porch steps, its weight making the wood groan in protest. It raised a claw, ready to reduce the door to splinters. But the door opened before it could strike. A small girl stood there, no more than 5 or 6. She was dressed as a ladybug, her red and black spotted costume pristine, her antennae wobbling gently. In her hands, she clutched a large rainbow-colored lollipop. Her eyes, wide and unafraid, looked up at the monstrous form that filled her doorway. She did not scream. She did not run. The monster paused, its killing claw still raised. This small, bright thing was not on the list. This was an interruption. It's an anomaly. The fury within it churned, demanding it swipe the obstruction away and continue its grim work. The ladybug took a small step forward. She looked at the monster's fearsome face, its glowing eyes, its bloody claws. Her brow furrowed not in fear, but in a kind of solemn consideration. "You're really scary," she said, her voice a small, clear bell in the silence. "You have the best costume." She extended the rainbow lollipop, holding it out toward him, adulterated offering. There was no hesitation, no fear, no expectation of anything in return. It was a treat given freely. The monster stared at the offered candy. The bright colors seemed to vibrate against the dark, blood-soaked backdrop of its vision. The simple, sweet gesture struck a chord deep within the chaos of its being. For a split second, the raging hunger faltered. The memory of what it had been, a little boy excited for candy, hoping for a full bucket, flared like a dying star in the dark expanse of its consciousness. Its claw, poised to destroy, slowly lowered. It did not take the lollipop, but it did not strike her down. It simply stood, a hulking paradox of violence and confusion, disarmed by a single act of innocent kindness. The moment stretched, fragile and surreal. The ladybug continued to hold out her treat, her small arm unwavering. Behind her, a terrified face appeared in the hallway, her mother frozen in horror, too afraid to move or call out. The monster's head tilted. A low, confused rumble escaped its throat, a sound utterly different from the savage roars that had torn through the night. It was the sound of a conflict it did not understand. Then, with a sudden, frustrated snarl, it turned away. It shoved past the porch rail, splintering the wood, and dropped heavily onto the lawn. It left the little ladybug standing there, her treat still offered to the night air, a single, untouched point of color in a world gone red. The monster lumbered away, its rage returning, but now tainted with a new, unsettling sensation. It had been given its first true treat of the night, and it had no idea what to do with it. The path of vengeance now had a crack in its foundation. The encounter with the ladybug was a pebble in the monster's mind. A small, smooth, and utterly alien thing in the jagged landscape of its rage. It tried to focus on the memory of the offered lollipop, the unafraid eyes, but the image slipped away, drowned out by the pounding rhythm of its own fury. The confusion it felt was a weakness. The hunger was a clarion call. It pushed the memory down, burying it under the weight of its purpose. The list. The list was everything. It was carved into its being, a map of every rejection, every flicker of fear, every closed door. The list was justice. The list was order. It shambled down the street, a moving monument to vengeance. The earlier screams had done their work. The neighborhood was now a ghost town of a different kind. Porch lights were extinguished, doors were barricaded, and terrified faces peered from behind slats and blinds. The monster was no longer a surprise. It was a known predator, and its territory was deathly quiet, save for the distant wail of sirens drawing closer. The silence did not deter it. It knew where they were hiding. It came to the Alvarez house. Mr. Alvarez had once shooed Leo away from his prized rose bushes, his voice sharp and dismissive. The monster did not approach the front door. It simply walked through the side gate, its bulk tearing the latch from the wood. In the backyard, a figure tried to flee toward the tool shed. The monster was upon him in 2 strides. The treat was taken quickly, almost mercifully, a splash of dark red against the pristine white of the garden gnomes. Next was the Petersons. Their dog, a yapping terrier, had chased a 6-year-old Leo off their lawn, while Mrs. Peterson watched from the window and did nothing. The monster tore the reinforced front door from its frame with a sound like a gunshot. The yapping turned to a terrified whimper, then to silence. The treat here was warmer, twin offerings that barely quenched the thirst. Each house was a checkbox on its grim itinerary. Each warm, yielding treat was a moment of satisfaction that faded faster than the last. The hunger was changing. It was no longer just a physical need. It was an insatiable void, a bottomless pit that demanded to be filled. The more it fed, the emptier it felt. The rage was the only constant, the only thing that made the emptiness bearable. It left a trail of devastation, in its wake shattered homes and broken bodies, a bloody breadcrumb path that led ever deeper into the night. The sirens were louder now, flashing blue and red lights painting the streets in frantic pulses, but they seemed irrelevant, a nuisance from another world. They were not on the list. The list was all that mattered. It was its scripture, its reason for being. And at the very top of that list, the original sin, the source of the hollow hunger, was one final name, one final house. The memory of a single bare bulb dying overhead and a gnarled hand that had bestowed this glorious, terrible purpose. The hunt for neighborhood slights was over. Ow. The real culmination of the night awaited. It turned its head, its glowing green eyes looking past the suburban streets, toward the older, darker part of town where the ancient oaks waited. The final treat would be the oldest. It would be the sweetest. The monster's purpose was now a laser focus. The petty grievances of the neighborhood fell away. The memory of the treats taken there, already cooling and fading into insignificance. There was only one name left on the list, the first and most important, the architect of its existence, the source. It moved with a new single-minded intensity, a shark cutting through water. It did not shamble now, strode, its powerful legs eating up the pavement, carrying it away from the tidy cul-de-sacs and back toward the older, weeping part of town. The air grew colder again. The cheerful decorations gave way to overgrown yards and the silent watchfulness of ancient gnarled trees. It was not a subtle creature. It was a force of nature, leaving a geography of ruin in its wake. It did not go around obstacles. It went through them. A picket fence became a cloud of splinters. A parked car was shoved aside, its metal frame shrieking in protest, leaving a long, deep gouge in the asphalt and a smear of dark, earthy green on the dented door. A low-hanging power line snapped with a blinding blue flash, and a shower of sparks plunging another block into darkness, adding its own private gloom to its pilgrimage. It was a trail of terror, but not one of stealth. It was an announcement. It was a challenge. It wanted her to know it was coming. The distant sirens had finally found the neighborhood it had left behind. The lights flickered against the low clouds, but they did not follow. They had found the carnage, and the scale of it was too vast, too horrifying to immediately comprehend. They were stopped, overwhelmed by the sheer, bloody arithmetic of the tragedy. The monster was free to move, unchallenged, through the deepening night. Its path was a straight line, an invisible thread pulling it back to the origin point. It crossed a playground, its swings moving gently in the wind like hanged men. The glow of its eyes reflected in the dark windows of the slide. Past the Little League field, a place of forgotten cheers, now just an empty expanse of mud and night. And with every step, the memory of the old woman's voice grew louder in its mind, drowning out the last fading echoes of the boy. Your hunger will be real. Your strength will be real. She had been right. She had given him this glorious, terrible gift, and now he would return to her, would show her the full, magnificent extent of the power she had unleashed. He would give her a trick that would eclipse all others. The familiar cul-de-sac opened up before it. The street was even darker than before, the ancient trees seeming to lean in closer, creating a tunnel of pure shadow. The other houses were completely dark, silent tombs. They knew, they had always known what lived at the end of the street, and there it was, the Victorian house. It looked exactly as it had ours before, yet utterly different. Then it had been a place of ominous potential. Now it was a known quantity, it was the lair, it was the source. The monster did not hesitate. It did not creep up the path. It strode, its heavy feet crushing the flagstones to powder. The single bare bulb above the door was dark, but it didn't matter. The monster could see perfectly in the dark. It could see the door of blistered wood. It could feel the ancient waiting presence on the other side. The hunt was over. The reckoning was here. It stopped before the door, its chest heaving, not from exertion, but from anticipation. The treat that waited inside would be the most satisfying of all. It would be the end of the hunger. It would be the end of everything. It raised a claw, not to knock, but to claim. The monster did not knock. It did not need to. Its arrival was a seismic event, announced by the splintering of flagstones and the low, thunderous rhythm of its breath. The door, the same blistered wood that had once swung open onto a void, was now just a flimsy barrier. It drew back a fist, the claws glistening with the evidence of its journey, and drove it forward. The door exploded inward, not swinging on its hinges, but disintegrating into a cloud of sawdust and shattered timber. The monster crossed the threshold, its hulking frame filling the doorway, its glowing green eyes scanning the interior. The air inside was thick and stagnant, heavy with the cloying scent of dried herbs, dust, and something older, the smell of parchment and forgotten prayers. The house was a museum of shadows, crammed with strange shapes under sheets, with glass jars containing murky, unidentifiable things lining dusty shelves. Cobwebs hung like tattered lace, and the floorboards were warped with age. And there, in the center of the main room, in a high-backed chair that looked like a throne of bone and shadow, she sat. The old woman. The source. She was exactly as he remembered, yet now she seemed less a person and more a feature of the house itself, a gnarled root that had broken through the floorboards. Her milky eyes were open, fixed on the doorway, waiting. A thin, knowing smile played on her lips. There was no fear in her. There was only a deep, ancient satisfaction. She had felt his approach. She had felt every death, every burst of warmth, every spike of terror. It had been a symphony to her, a proof of her power. "You have been busy, my creation," she whispered, her voice the dry rustle of a snake moving through dead leaves. It filled the room without effort. "You have feasted on the fear I promised you." The monster let out a roar that shook the jars on their shelves, a sound of pure, undiluted hatred. It was not a sound of gratitude. It was a challenge. It took a heavy step forward, its clawed feet digging grooves into the rotten floor. The old woman did not flinch. She slowly raised one skeletal hand. On her wrist, the skin was marked with a symbol, a twisted, spiraling brand that seemed to pulse with a faint black light. It was the same symbol that was burned into the monster's wrist, the source of the icy fire that bound them. "You think you have come for me?" she crooned. "You are a limb of my will, a weapon in my hand. You cannot strike the hand that wields you," the monster charged. Its intent was a physical force, a wave of destructive energy aimed at the chair, at the smug, ancient thing sitting within it. But the old woman moved her hand in a subtle, complex gesture. Agony, white-hot and absolute, lanced through the monster's brand. It was a pain beyond anything it had felt, a fire that raced up its arm and seized its heart, freezing it in mid-beat. The monster stumbled, its roar choking off into a strangled gasp. It crashed to its knees, its immense strength rendered useless. It was not a physical blow, but a metaphysical one. She was pulling at strings, reminding it of its place. It was her spell, her creature, belonged to her. It looked up, its green eyes blazing with helpless fury. The old woman watched it from her chair, her smile widening. She was enjoying this. This was the final trick. The ultimate power was not in the killing, but in the absolute control over the killer. "You are mine," she whispered, her voice dripping with vile triumph. "You will always be mine. Now go. The sirens are close. Go and finish your work. Bring more fear into the world. Sustains me." She made another gesture, and the pain intensified. A command to obey. The monster knelt on the creaking floor, its body trembling, not from fear, but from the volcanic rage of being so completely mastered. The hunt, the vengeance, the glorious freedom of its power had all been an illusion. It was just a dog on a leash, and she held the other end. The hunger meant nothing. The treats meant nothing. It was all for her. And in that moment of utter, devastating subjugation, the last tiny spark of the boy who had wanted nothing but candy, the spark that had been shielded by the ladybug's kindness, screamed in silent, desperate rebellion. The monster knelt on the groaning floorboards, a puppet whose strings were made of searing pain. The old woman's will was an iron clamp around its mind, a command that overrode its own rage, its own hunger. "Go, bring more fear. It sustains me." The words echoed, not in the air, but in the very fabric of its cursed being. It was not a hunter, it was a harvest tool, and she was the reaper. Its body began to move, obeying the compulsion. It started to rise, its muscles twitching under the foreign command, its head turning toward the shattered doorway and the sirens that promised more treats for its master. But deep within, in a place the spell had not been able to completely erase, the spark of Leo fought. It was a tiny, desperate thing, a memory of a mother's hug, a father's laugh, the offered rainbow lollipop. It was the memory of being a boy, not a thing. And that spark screamed of final silent denial. The monster's head snapped back toward the woman, its glowing green eyes fixed on her. The compulsion to leave warred with a newer, more primal urge. The instinct to destroy the source of its pain. A guttural snarl, this one entirely its own, ripped from its throat. The pain from the brand flared, a white-hot warning, a punishment for its disobedience. The old woman's smug smile faltered, her milky eyes widened a fraction. For the first time, she saw something in her creation she had not anticipated. Not just mindless fury, but will. "No," she hissed, her voice losing its dry confidence, becoming sharp and imperative. She made another, more violent gesture with her hand. The pain exploded, threatening to shatter the monster's mind. It roared, a sound of pure agony, but it did not turn away. It took a step toward her, its body shaking with the effort of fighting the command. Each step was a tectonic shift, a battle between the spell's absolute power and a rebellion born from the deepest core of its stolen humanity. The old woman rose from her chair, her face a mask of fury and sudden fear. "I said go," she shrieked, her voice cracking. The monster took another step, the distance between them closed. The air crackled with unseen energy, the conflict of two immense wills. Jarred on the shelves rattled and shattered, their murky contents spilling like black blood onto the floor. With a final, supreme effort that felt like tearing its own soul in two, the monster raised a claw. It was not raised to obey, it was raised to strike. The old woman's eyes went wide with true terror. She raised her own hands, not in a command but in a feeble, physical defense. It was too late. The claw swept down. It was not like the other kills. There was no frenzy, no wild tearing. It was a single, precise, and utterly devastating blow. It was an execution. The treat that followed was not warm. It was cold and ancient, a bitter, dusty sweetness that filled the monster's senses. It was the taste of a long life, twisted and spent in darkness. It was not satisfying. It was empty. As the life left the old woman, the brand on the monster's wrist flared one last time with an agonizing, icy fire and then crumbled to ash, leaving only a pale, painless mark behind. The compulsion vanished. The strings were cut. The monster stood over the source of the spell, now just a broken, empty vessel. The silence that fell was absolute and profound. The sirens, the hunger, the rage, it all faded into a distant hum. It had one. It was free. But the freedom was a vast, terrifying emptiness. The purpose that had driven it was gone. The hunger remained, but now it was a hollow ache with no direction. It had taken the final, bittersweet, and it had left it with nothing. It stood alone in the dark, silent house, the master of its own destiny, and the weight of everything it had done crashed down upon it. It was free, but it was also lost. And the world outside was still full of treats it no longer had the will to take. The monster stood adrift in a sea of silence. The source was gone, her bitter treat a cold ash on its tongue. The compulsion that had been its compass was extinguished, leaving a void more terrifying than any hunger. The rage was spent, a fire that had burned down to embers, revealing the scorched and barren landscape it had left behind. It shambled out of the corpse of the house, its movements slow, devoid of purpose. The night air, once charged with the electricity of the hunt, was now just cold. The distant sirens were a meaningless noise. It was a ghost, but one made of blood and flesh, an unbearable memory. It did not know where to go. There was no home to return to. The list was complete. It wandered, a lost king, in a ruined kingdom of its own making, its heavy feet carrying it without direction. It found itself on the edge of a park, a place of normalcy, that now felt like an artifact from a dead world. The swings were still. The slide was a silver tongue in the moonlight. And then it saw her. A figure small and hunched was hiding behind the thick trunk of an oak tree at the edge of the park. She was peering out, not at the monster, but down the street toward the flashing lights and the chaos it had spawned. She was dressed in a simple ghost costume, a white sheet with 2 eye holes, now smudged with dirt and grass stains. The monster knew her. Not as a name on a list, not as a treat to be taken, but from before. From the world of sunlight and classrooms. She sat 2 rows over from Leo. She had lent him a green crayon once when his had broken. She turned her head and her gaze through the ragged holes in the sheet fell upon the monster. She did not scream. She did not run. She froze. A small white statue in the shadows. But it was not the frozen terror of its other victims. It was a different kind of stillness, one of dawning, horrifying recognition. The monster had stopped moving. It stood at the edge of the wood chips, its massive, stitched together form a blight on the innocent landscape of the playground. Its claws were caked in drying blood. Its chest was matted with it. It was the stuff of nightmare, undeniable and real. Mia's hand slowly came up and pulled the ghost sheet from her head. Her face was pale, her eyes wide, but they were fixed on the monster with an intensity that cut through the darkness. She was not looking at a monster. She was looking through it. She saw the lopsided snarl of the mouth, now a real and terrible feature, but once a carefully crafted rubber mask. She saw the shocking black hair, now matted with gore, but once made of yarn. She saw the bulky, stitched-together shape. She remembered a proud father showing off his handiwork at the school Halloween parade just that morning. Her lips moved, forming a name, a whisper so quiet it was stolen by the wind. But the monster saw it. It read the shape on her lips. Leo. The soundless name was a detonation in the monster's mind. It was a key turning in a lock that had been sealed shut by rage and dark magic. It was not a command. It was not a trick. It was a question, a recognition of what lay buried beneath the horror. The monster took an involuntary step back. The void within it yawned wide, and into that void rushed a tsunami of what it had been, the excitement, fear, the love for his parents, the crushing weight of what he had done. The monster's form seemed to shudder, not with rage, but with a pain far more profound. It was seen, not as a monster, but as the boy it had once been. And in that recognition was the beginning of its end. The name hung in the air between them, a silent, seismic word. Leo. The monster recoiled from it, as if from a holy symbol. The void inside it, once filled with rage, and then with emptiness, was now flooded with a torrent of memory. The warmth of his home, the sound of his mother's laughter, the weight of his father's hand on his shoulder. The sight of them broken, and a low, agonized moan escaped the monster's throat, a sound of pure, unendurable grief. It was not a monster's roar. It was a boy's sob, distorted and trapped within a cage of flesh and stitch. Mia flinched at the sound, but held her ground. Her eyes, wide with a terror that was now mixed with a dawning, heartbreaking pity, remained locked on it. She could see the conflict now, the war within the horrific form. She saw the creature shudder, its claws, those instruments of terrible slaughter, trembling. Her own fear was a living thing, screaming at her to run, to hide, to never look back. But she also saw her classmate, the boy who'd needed a green crayon. Her hand, small and shaking, dipped into the pocket of her jeans. She pulled out a single, slightly crumpled, fun-sized chocolate bar. It was her last piece of candy, saved for herself. The wrapper was bright red, a tiny, cheerful spot of color in the overwhelming darkness. She didn't know why she was doing it. It was an impulse, a gesture that bypassed all reason and terror. It was the only thing she could think to offer to a boy who was lost inside a monster. With a trembling arm, she extended the candy bar toward the shuddering behemoth. There was no words, no plea, just an offering, a treat. Given not out of fear or obligation, but out of a desperate, innocent hope. The monster stared at the small red bar, saw the offering not as sustenance but as a symbol. It was the opposite of everything it had been created for. It was not taken in violence. It was given in compassion. It was not warm and bloody. It was cool and wrapped. It was the last piece of candy on Halloween. The memory of the ladybug's lollipop, a moment of grace it had been unable to accept, merged with this new offering. This time, there was no list. No rage. No curse to fight against. There was only the vast, horrifying pain of what it had done, and this one, small chance for a different ending. Slowly, with a grinding effort that seemed to take all its remaining strength, the monster's massive, blood-caked claw rose. It did not swipe. It did not grab. It uncurled, the terrible fingers opening with a delicacy that seemed impossible. With the very tips of its claws, it gently took the offered candy bar from Mia's palm. The touch was feather-light, a conscious restraint of unimaginable power. As its fingers closed around the treat, a pure white light erupted from its chest. It was not a harsh light, but a soft, cleansing radiance that spilled from every stitch, every seam of its monstrous form. The monster cried out, not in pain but in release, as the light consumed it. The grotesque body began to dissolve, the powerful limbs shrinking, the claws retracting, the stitches vanishing like smoke. The transformation was not a violent rupture, but an unraveling. The monster was being unwound, its dark magic undone by the simplest, purest magic of all. Where the hulking beast had stood, a small boy now crumpled to the ground on his knees. Leo, dressed only in his pajamas, pale and shivering, with the ashes of a monstrous past dusting his skin. In his small, clean hand, he clutched a fun-sized chocolate bar. The curse was broken. The treat had been given and accepted. The hunt was finally, truly over. Dawn broke over a town forever scarred. The sun, a pale and hesitant eye, rose to illuminate a landscape of tragedy. Police tape, a garish yellow, fluttered everywhere, cordoning off shattered homes and silent streets. The air, once crisp with autumn promise, was now heavy with the lingering sense of smoke, blood, and a profound communal grief. The night had ended, but its horror was etched into the very asphalt. In the sterile, bright light of a hospital room, Leo opened his eyes. The world was soft-hedged and quiet. The beep of a monitor was a steady, gentle rhythm. He was tucked into a narrow bed, the sheets clean and white. For a long moment, he simply lay there, floating in a numb, medication-induced haze. There was no thought, only a vague sense of being safe, of being contained. Then, memory returned. It did not come as a flood, but as a series of sharp, brutal images, each one a shard of glass tearing through the calm. The old woman's whisper, the feeling of his bones twisting, the warmth on his face, the look in his mother's eyes a second before. A sound escaped him, a weak, broken whimper. He squeezed his eyes shut, but the images were burned on the inside of his eyelids. He became aware of a bandage on his wrist, covering the place where the brand had been, where now only a pale, circular scar remained, the only physical proof any of it had been real. A police officer sat in a chair by the door, his posture weary, his face grim. He saw the boy stir and looked over, his expression a complex mix of pity and unasked questions. Leo looked away, his small heart hammering against his ribs. He knew what they had found. He knew what they thought. He knew what he had done. The door opened softly, and a social worker came in, her face a careful mask of compassion. She spoke in a low, soothing voice, words about being brave, about being found in the park, about how everything was going to be all right. They were hollow sounds. Nothing would ever be all right again. He learned in those quiet, terrible conversations that Mia had told her story. She had told them about the monster and about the boy inside it. They called it a trauma-induced hallucination, a mind's way of protecting itself from an unimaginable horror. They spoke of a lone, unknown assailant still on the loose. They believed the little girl had seen a murderer, and her mind had invented a monster to make sense of it. They did not believe her. Leo said nothing. He clutched the thin hospital blanket, his small fingers gripping it like a lifeline. He knew the truth was a heavier burden than any lie. To speak it would not bring back the dead. It would only make him a monster in a different way, a thing to be studied and feared. He was given toast. He did not eat it. Later, from his window, he watched the world outside. People moved like ghosts, their faces drawn with loss and confusion. He saw a news van parked down the street, saw a family hugging on a sidewalk, weeping with relief that their own were safe. Their joy a stark contrast to the desolation inside him. He was an orphan now. His home was a crime scene. His childhood was a graveyard. The morning after was quiet, it was clean. It was sterile. It was the world trying to wash away the blood and pretend the night had never happened, but Leo could still smell it. He could still feel the phantom weight of the claws, the echo of the hunger, the cold, bitter sweet of the old woman's end. He looked down at his hands. They were small. They were clean. They were a boy's hands. But he knew what they had done. The promise of candy had been a lie. The real treat had been the morning itself, the chance to wake up, to see the sun, to be human. And it was a treat he knew he would never truly taste again. He had traded it all for a night of tricks, and the cost was etched in blood on his soul forever. The morning after had come, but for Leo, the night would never truly end.